So good morning, everybody. How are you? I'm saying that like I'm expecting a response. Uh, Crazy Monday morning here. There's a lot that happened in the news over the weekend. Some related to the industry, some related to other affairs. As we scramble to just get everything going this morning, I know there's a lot of talk right now about the big McLaughlin case, and you may have heard a little chatter about that, just a second ago. We are getting to a point to where we will be talking about that. Puja and I are going to be joined by Aaron Weiss, who's another, great friend of the industry, somebody who you've probably seen speak at a lot of our events and on some of our webinars. He'll be joining us, and Aaron and I will be getting together on Wednesday to discuss this. It'll be the same time Wednesday. There'll be a registration link coming out, hopefully within the next 24 hours so that everybody can sign up for that and attend. And I know that everybody was talking Chevron for a long time, and then everybody's like, now Hobbs. That's happened. I'm sure there's a lot of questions to be answered, and we will get to that in a couple of days. So please watch for that. But in the meantime, what I would like to focus on right now is the webinar of the day. So thank you all for joining us. My name is Isaac Schloss. I'm the Chief Product Officer here at Contact Center Compliance. For those of you who are not familiar with us or maybe know us by our other name of DNC.com, we are an organization that partners with companies in the calling space to help them make compliance easy through a wide variety of solutions, where essentially we help scrub lists for people you're not allowed to call, looking at things like the do not call list, number reassignment, also looking for known litigators that might be hiding in your list, people who professionally they make a living by suing companies for calling them. We help you find them and get them out of your list. Once you've done that, and once you've gone through a compliance process, we can also help you maximize your call deliverability through our remediation product. We can also help you with caller ID branding if you want to put a more personalized touch on those calls so that you can better convey to your audience who's calling. A couple quick housekeeping notes that we've got here. There is a Q&A tab. So if anybody has questions or comments throughout this, please put those in there. We will do our best to address them throughout the entire call. But if we do run out of time, as we very often do, we will do our very best to follow up within the next day or two. Either myself or Puja, depending on who it seems the question is best answered by. But we'll only be able to do that if you pose these with a valid email address. So if you post a question as an anonymous and we don't get to it, I'm sorry. But you can visit dnc.com. You can also go to troutmanamin.com if you want to connect directly with Puja or her fabulous team that she has over there. But you can also keep that conversation going afterwards, and we would love to have that. So finally, while our speakers are often attorneys, as is our guest speaker today, every business is very different. So the information shared here should be taken as just general insights into what's going on in the industry, not necessarily legal advice. If you want to make any changes to how you're dialing or act on any of the information you have today, I recommend you consult this with qualified counsel who specializes in the TCPA. And if you don't have anyone in that capacity, I have a really good recommendation for you, and she's on the call today. So all of that being said, I'd like everybody to welcome my guest speaker, Puja Amin. Many know her as Queenie. She is a partner over at the fabulous Troutman Amin. She is just a staple of our industry as far as a source of truth, an expert, a successful litigator, defense attorney anyway in our space. And Puja is going to join us today to talk about kind of a recent uptick we have seen in some of our and some of the lawsuits that are coming out there right now, where there has been a change on something that's often known as quiet laws or curfew hours. And just at a high level, for those of you who are out there, there are federal limitations to when you can contact someone. And the federal regulation is 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. market time. States are allowed to preempt that and have more restrictive rules. Many of them do. That's a very high-level overview of just the quiet hours in general. But Puja, let me hand this over to you to kind of set the kind of a baseline as you see it.
Yeah, Isaac, thanks for that brief background. For those folks who are on this webinar, I suspect you have either been faced with the new quiet hour lawsuits or are just curious as to what the new litigation trend is here in TCPA world. So let's start with a quick background, right? The Telephone Consumer Protection Act, which we're all pretty familiar with, requires telemarketers to obtain call or text message recipients, at least for now, prior express written consent prior to sending it calls or text messages or telephone solicitations, if you will. The TCPA and its implementing rules restrict you from making telephone solicitations to a residential telephone number from 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. of the call times or the text times recipient's location. And as Isaac mentioned, this is generally known as the quiet hours provision. And there has been a huge uptick since November of 2024, just, in the last few months of litigation surrounding violating the quiet hours provision. I mean, as you know, Isaac, in TCPA world, we're seeing all new theories being tested all the time, and this is just the latest here at TCPA world.
Yeah, so it's interesting when we get into this type of discussion because, right away when we've seen all these lawsuits, I've seen a fairly strong argument around whether or not these even qualify for the private right of action. And this has to do with some of the definition around where that private right of action applies and where some of this consent lies. And that's around the telephone solicitation limitations, correct?
That is correct, Isaac. So, as you folks know, right, if you violate the TCPA, you can be fined up to $500, a call or text, or up to $1,500. Now, within that, right, you have defenses to, whether you can send telemarketing solicitations or not. And one of those is obtaining consent, right, prior express written consent. Now, whether a private right of action applies to the quiet hours provisions, maybe, maybe not, right? If you ask my firm, if you ask the litigators at my shop, absolutely not, right? And it's quite simple, right? When you look at the plain reading of the CFR, right, which is embedded in 62.1200C1, that section only applies to telephone solicitations. And the definition of telephone solicitations within the statute does not include calls or text messages to a called party with that party's prior express invitation or permission. So, arguably, if you are sending text messages to a recipient with that prior express invitation or permission, you do not fall within the definition of telephone solicitation, which is restricted by the CFR. So, there's this new theory. It's really coming out of one law firm out of Florida, the Jibril Hindi law firm, and they're testing this not necessarily to take this all the way to class certification or to trial, but really, for what we think to get really quick settlements and kind of test this theory in courts even at the pleading stage currently. But, as it remains right now, it is unclear whether the TCPA's timing restrictions apply to call and text messages made with express written consent. But nevertheless, right, folks are getting these lawsuits, they're getting class action cases in arguing that the quiet time provisions are applicable unless you specifically got consent to call at 7 a.m. or 10 p.m.
Now, it's interesting when you bring up the Florida firm that's been filing these. I mean, we're not talking 1, 2, 5, 10 ballpark. Where are we at right now with this one filer?
I think we're at least 300 probably by now. I haven't checked probably in like a month or two. And I know earlier this year, we were at least in the hundreds. It might be more. Honestly, Isaac, I wouldn't be surprised if we are at the 400, 500. And keep in mind, that's not even calculating the demands, right? The pre-suit demands that this firm is sending out. I have a lot of clients who are receiving the demands, right? Debating whether they want to settle these cases. And we'll get to this in a bit, Isaac, but testing your strategy after McKesson on whether you should settle these cases or not is something that all folks who are receiving these frivolous demands or class action lawsuits should not settle.
And it's funny because the way that the demand letter thing is so critical here because people talk about catching litigators, going after litigators, stopping them. I mentioned at the beginning of the list that there's a whole industry around it, and the really critical part of this is that when it comes to cases that go to court, we can find out about those pretty easily. But there are so many demand letters that go out there that just don't get put on the radar at all. We have a website called stoplitigators.com. I'll ask my back office team to put that into the chat or something there, where we do offer an ability for companies to help us build a crowdsourced database around who these litigators are. But more importantly, these are the kinds of things where there's such an expense just involved in the defense alone that a lot of companies say, you know what, I don't know if I'm right, I don't know if I'm wrong, I don't know if this telephone solicitation defense is really going to work. I'm just going to settle. And unfortunately, that kind of feeds the beast. So, when you have somebody, especially somebody that you've got an actual relationship with as your attorney, if they're saying don't pay, there's a very, very valid reason for that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Isaac. And, a lot of these demands are a venue for plaintiff's attorneys to kind of test, right, where your pockets are at to see how eager you are to settle, right, how eager you're to fight back, and they're assessing, right, what attorneys you're going to hire on the defense side, whether you're going to send this to insurance defense counsel, whether you're going to lob a consent record that may not be sufficient enough in their lens, right? So it is almost a way, often it's a way for plaintiff's attorneys to get some of that discovery without the formal litigation process backing them up. So you really want to be careful when you're responding to those demands. I understand, often it's easier just to throw, some lump sum of money at these plaintiffs' attorneys. And sometimes, it might be appropriate depending on who you're dealing with, right? Even with some of those serial litigators, you might just want to throw 500, $1,000 at them just to avoid the cost of litigation. But with cases, at least like these quiet hour provisions, my goodness, right? There was already good defenses available before Friday's ruling in McKesson, but now there's even more, concrete defenses available that, you cannot let this guy or firms like this guy's firm get away with these rulings. It's just going to make bad law. It's going to allow him and others like him to really take advantage of the industry. And you really want to look at if you have a good consent record that allows you to make a telephone solicitation, and just because you did not explicitly get that consent for outside of those quiet hour provisions, then you may want to fight this, right? You may want to hire good counsel to help you make good law and kind of turn around this new onslaught of frivolous lawsuits.
And it's funny because, if you're having, let's say you get one of these demand letters and you're having this conversation with Puja, and this is the first time you talk to Puja, you're already too late, because one of the things that will happen, and she touched on this already, when they're testing your defenses, part of it might be, okay, let's get into a court environment, let's get to discovery, let's try to get a whole bunch of data from you. And maybe this becomes much bigger than just a one call action or one person, and maybe this turns into a class action case. So, there's definitely things that you want to try to do ahead of time to create a more defendable position so you don't find yourself in this position in the first place. We do have a couple questions. I'm going to get to those in a second, but before I do, for any of you who don't already, please follow TCPA World. There are, I would guess, an average of 5 or 6 posts a day at least on just updates on all kinds of crazy cases that are going out there. And one that comes to mind right away is Volkswagen. You guys did a story on that about a month ago, as I want to say, and they settled for some small amount. It's like 250,000, 275,000. It was a small settlement amount by comparison, but then their defense cost was 2.2 million. So essentially, this still cost them $2.5 million to get to that point. So is there really a winner there? I guess you could argue, well, at least they didn't pay 20 million, 30 million, but when you're still out millions of dollars, it doesn't feel like much of a win. So, when people are looking at a few of these things or a few of these questions, one of them they're asking about right away, can you name the firm that's involved? I don't remember the name of the gentleman who's filed most of these.
Jibril Hindi.
There it is. All
There.
right. So for those of you who've asked that question, there you are.
Yeah, I think his name is the law offices of Jibril Hindi. It's as simple as that. He's out in
Oh,
Florida.
so and there has been a very, very heavy concentration from this specific individual. So this isn't just speculation or anything like that. Now, a lot of times when one plaintiff finds a good tactic that's effective and working, everybody else is going to copy them, just like you see in a defense world where, the Troutman Amin firm has some groundbreaking defense that blows away a case, just completely shoots down the other side. A lot of people are going to try to copy that too. So, the copying happens on both sides. Everybody's trying to be successful at the end of the day in what they're doing. But when it comes down to this type of thing, the first thing I get asked from people, and I got this a lot after you guys started running these stories, is do we need to update our consent language that says we can call or text whatever? And I find that to be an interesting question because there's certain laws that are out there that say you can't do this without consent, you can't do that without consent. But then there's other ones that say nothing about consent, which arguably would say that consent doesn't get around that regulation, that restriction. So on the one hand, I'm saying if you don't meet the need of telephone solicitation, I feel like that part is kind of out of there anyway. But setting that argument aside, can someone structure the consent language that would allow them to call outside of legal calling hours?
That's a great question, Isaac. And I think the reason why that question in particular is popping up as most recently is because that plaintiff's attorney is actually requiring that the consent language state that you are going to be receive calls outside of those quiet hour provisions, right? So he is actually looking at consent language or disclosures that have that language in there. Now, I see no harm in including that, right? It doesn't make the disclosure any lengthier. You can be put it into like a few words, right? That you consent to receive telephone solicitations from all hours of the day, not just between 8 a.m. and 9 p.m. And it will surely provide you a defensible position, right? I think the larger issue is all those consent records that, are otherwise valid that don't have that provision before these onslaught of lawsuits have been incurring. So that's the larger issue, right? Sure, from today and onwards, you can include that, but what happens for the last 4 years? And he's, good on him for kind of finding this little loophole and testing it out in courts. But short answer is I would, but at the same time, I don't want to motivate, individuals and folks and plaintiffs' attorneys to require this in consent languages because it's never been required, right? It's not in the CFR, it's not in the TCPA. My goodness, the TCPA, right? Speaking of McKesson, doesn't even require a quiet hour provision, right? That was something that was implemented literally by the FCC, right? Congress didn't require it, the TCPA doesn't require it. It was something that the FCC had implemented, right? So short answer, put it in if you're okay with it, right? If it's not going to impact your conversion, which I doubt it will, but keep in mind all those consent records that you have acquired previous to these lawsuits.
Yeah, and that's a great question, or that's a great point. It's, there's always room for improvement. We've always got to change our tactics, our strategy. So if you identify a gap in your compliance, close it as quickly as possible so that moving forward, you're in a great position. But that doesn't absolve you from any of the stuff that is suddenly a rule that retroactively takes effect. And again, it can be debated if this even is a rule, but from the current point of argument, let's just say that this is all true. Let's just say that these are legitimate cases. Then retroactively, if you've been doing this over the last 4 years, you're in a bad position. So that kind of takes to the question of, why should you be calling someone at that time of day? And notice I keep using the word call. I keep using the word call, one, because I'm old, or at least I feel old. I got into the industry in 99. And back then, that's all you did was you called. There wasn't, texting was like that new hot thing. And so a lot of these regulations that were written in the early 90s did not have text messages in mind because nobody knew what that was, certainly nobody in Washington. So, it's been held over the course of the last 20 years that a call and a text are essentially the same thing at the federal level. The states have done a little bit more work to set different rules for them, but federally, they're kind of the same. So I say call, I mean call or text, but it's obviously very different, right? Because when a phone call happens, there's an expectation that the ringer is on, that the phone's going to make these loud noises. When it's a text message, a lot of people think of that in the same lines of email of, hey, I sent you this for you to get back to me whenever is convenient for you. So, I saw one person saying, well, hey, I've got, and this, I run this all the time. They are on a lead gen site. It's 3 a.m. they fill out a form and they're asking for some sort of acknowledgement or something like that, or there needs to be some sort of message sent to them confirming their purchase or that they're signing up for this site. They're interacting with you at 3 a.m.
Mhm.
Given where things are today, should that company wait until the next morning? Should that company have a message that says, hey, we need to text you, but legally we can't until such and such time? How would you navigate that just from a general perspective?
Well, put yourself in the shoes of a reasonable consumer. I don't want to receive text messages at 3 a.m., right? Say I forget to put my phone on silent that night and it
Mhm.
wakes me up, right? It's irritating. Sometimes text messages can be as irritating as calls. It just depends on the consumer, right? But and really, is there a business reason to be sending that text message at 3 a.m.? I mean, to me, you're going to get a better response rate when folks are awake, right? Like when I choose to put a blog on tcpaworld.com, I am looking at the rest of the country, right? I'm not going to post something at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. I mean, the czar will do his after dark post, right? And there's an audience for certain folks, right? But I mean, there's an audience for certain of those posts, but generally you want to be marketing to folks where you're going to receive a positive response. In light of these new lawsuits, however, right, you should really now be thinking about when you want to send your calls or text messages, right, and kind of evaluating the time zones with the state restrictions, at least until we can get some good law on the books, right? And I know I mentioned that I don't want to feed this guy or motivate this guy or guys like him to file more of these lawsuits, but lawsuits happen, the litigation arises, and then we have to check our compliance, right? And kind of button up in light of the new cases that are coming out. So I think, at least for now, Isaac, right, until this guy stops, or at least there's some bad ruling, against the plaintiff's side, or at least until the McKesson line of cases start flowing through of whether text even equal calls, right? Whether that's a whole nother issue too, right? Are texts still going to equal calls after folks start filing rulings in light of McKesson, right? We don't know yet, right? What we do know is that the FCC declaratory rulings have said that text equals calls, and there have been courts that have followed that same or affirmed that same interpretation, right? So we don't know where that's going to lead. Likewise, we don't know what's going to happen after McKesson when it comes to the quiet hour provisions, right? Whether that is actually required under the TCPA or whether it was just FCC guidance. We'll discuss obviously more of that on Wednesday's webinar and dive deeper into that. But, short answer, if I am your compliance attorney, right, I can't give legal advice, but, I would just really look at your calling and texting practices, kind of limited to the most restrictive call time zones if you can, right? I know often it is difficult from a business perspective to limited to the most restrictive, right? The most restrictive state and limited from that small, you're essentially cutting off 4 to 6 hours, right? So I know that can be difficult, but also utilizing other data points, right? Utilizing other information that you have can be extremely meaningful, at least until these lawsuits kind of settle away.
And so when it comes to this 3 a.m. thing, you have to ask yourself as a business, is this essential? And I know the question was posed around, well, somebody's on my website at 3 a.m., they fill that out. I need to do that confirmation, but is there another way you can do that confirmation? Can your logic in your website be generated to maybe during certain hours say, I'm going to send it to your email instead of sending it to your phone? And again, this is where you need to be talking to your compliance attorney about your very specific use case. What is that text message for? If you're talking about something like two-factor authentication, you're going to be in a very different position than something that is clear solicitation or marketing. So, again, just think about all of those dynamics and then have a conversation with your TCPA specialist attorney. Again, I'm not knocking in-house counsel at all, but you got to understand a lot of businesses, they'll get a good in-house attorney who is focused on general law, business law. TCPA is a completely different animal. So hopefully they have someone that they work with for those specific areas, but just, ask those questions.
Yeah,
Um,
Isaac, that's a good point, right? It really depends on what kind of solicitations you're sending out, right? If you really need to look at one first, the message to first determine if it in fact is a solicitation, and then your audience, right? Who your recipients are. Folks are in all different verticals, have all different campaigns, so it may make sense, if you're sending out a 3 a.m. text. It just really, really depends. And I think to your point, Isaac, it helps when you're sharing that information with your counsel so they can better assess your specific, what's the best case scenario for your specific needs.
Absolutely. And there's one person who asked a question about, the Hindi firm having gone after them and threatened a class action suit, and you've, started going down the road of a settlement. Now you're asking, should you rethink it? Honestly, this is a conversation I would have with Pooja directly one-on-one, because this is the kind of thing where everything is nuanced. So it'd have to be specific to what you're doing. That would help drive the risk. And then that would really help determine if you've taken the right approach. Sometimes that settlement on that demand letter, unfortunately, is the best way to go, but not always. I can't even argue a majority of the time. If you are paying out in a lot of demand letters, that could also mean that you've got bigger problems and you could just close those gaps and stop that altogether. So you say, well, Pooja's time's going to be expensive for a couple hours. Check out some of the class action lawsuit settlements and compare that to the cost of a couple hours of Puja. You're going to spend a lot less money on Puja. Same thing could be said about our litigator scrub. Yeah, you might spend $500 a month, but if we help you avoid just one settlement, you're going to pay for that list. So, take all of that into consideration. Don't cheap out on compliance. It's going to pay dividends in the back end from what you're not paying.
Isaac, is it really only $500 a month for that litigator scrub?
That is, I think, one of our mid-tier. I think our smallest package is like $220 or something like that, and that gives you all DNC and everything like that too. You're talking sub penny per record. It is not expensive to weed out attorneys, and we find so many of them. So, in fact, if anybody comes to our website, fills out the contact form, someone from our team can call you. You can send them a list, and we'll tell you how many litigators we find. No charge, no commitments, no nothing, and you can decide if that product is something you need. I love telling this story. I'm sorry I'm going on a tangent, but I was a customer of the product at 4 different large BPOs, like global BPOs, before I came here. And I was at one of them, and the product had just come out. My sales rep was trying to sell me on it. I'm like, this isn't going to work. That's not a thing. And he convinces me. So I tell one of my developers, send him the list and we'll figure it out. So he sends him the list, and my sales rep goes quiet for like 2 weeks, which is really unusual for my sales rep. He finally called me back, and he's like, I need to know where you got this list from, because I made my development team go over this 5 times. I was sure there's a bug. I've never seen a list that had a 93% hit rate before. And, blew my mind. So I contacted the developer. I'm like, where'd you get this list from? We had a program that directly targeted attorneys' offices, setting appointments to sell them legal solutions. So the whole list was full of people that had in some way, shape, or form been involved in something TCPA in the last, year or two. So it quickly sold me on the concept. It identified almost my entire list. In that case, we went to our client and had, a special addendum done that says, hey, you're going to accept liability if I'm calling these people, blah, blah, blah. But again, this is where you could really work with a good compliance attorney to help you assess risk and determine your best go forward practice. Now, there are other risks, and one person asked about this right here. What does the law say about a customer signing up with the wrong phone number? Bottom line, you call it, it's your responsibility. There are lead fraud, and I'm using that term loosely here, but there are lead fraud solutions that are available on the market, some of them to help just determine if a real person from a real place is signing up. But then there's other ones that help marry that information together. Does the name match the number on public record? I can tell you at dnc.com, we have that solution, but unless you've got anything else you want to add to that, Pooja, I mean, it's pretty much just you break it, you bought it.
Yeah, and the wrong number issues, as you know, Isaac, it's a huge avenue for class action certifications, right? That is something that, that the top level plaintiffs attorneys, right? Not the Jibril folks, the really top-notch intelligent folks. Those are the folks that are pursuing those wrong number cases. And, if you call the wrong number, you can be sued under the TCPA.
Yeah, and so there's 2 different types. There's the wrong number right on the form. There's the wrong number because it was the right number when they filled out your lead form in January, and now they've gotten a new phone number in May, and it's not the right number anymore. We can also help with that. We've got a number reassignment solution, but yeah, again, you dial it, you take that full risk. So kind of diving into that part a little bit, you break it, you bought it. There is roughly, last I checked, something like 32 of the states have laws that are more restrictive on when you can call than the federal law. Our compliance guide solution, I never plug products on these calls, at least not at this level, but I swear it's just really easy today with this one. We have a guide that helps you determine when you're allowed to call people. We've got a product that's part of our DNC and litigator scrub. It's built into that. It'll tell you when you can call people. But Utah has a rule about no calls on Sunday as an example, and I think Alabama and a couple states in that area do. There are states where calling ends at 8. There are states that calling doesn't start until 9. I mean, those rules are all over the place. So you have to, regardless, you have to follow those rules. But one of the questions that comes up is, how do I determine where somebody is or what time zone to use? When you go back 30 years ago, it was really easy, the phone number. Phone number, in the 90s, let's just say, when these rules came out about calling, very easy. Or maybe it was late 90s, early 2000s, the time of day was added. But phone number is very reliable. Now we're in a mobile world. I've got a cell phone here with 2 phone numbers on it. One is for Indiana, one is for California. I am in Arizona most of the time. So if you use that information on where my time zone is, you may or may not be accurate depending on the time of year. So when customers come to you, you mentioned other data points. Is that a solid strategy, using those other data points?
Yes, right. Setting aside the fact that the FCC has actually come down on carriers for sharing some of that data, right? So let's set that aside for a second. But yeah, the data points, right? Looking at what you have in your possession to determine where a recipient is at the time they receive that telephone solicitation is crucial, right? It's kind of the only way to really determine these days of where that individual is when they receive that text message, right? Folks are constantly moving around and traveling. So what happens if you have a California area code like myself, but I'm constantly jetting across the country and I end up in, let's say, Wisconsin and I receive a telephone solicitation, right? How are you going to know whether I was in Wisconsin at that time, right? It is extremely difficult, but you have to at a minimum. And then you also have folks who, have a California area code, but they move. And oftentimes people are keeping their own phone numbers across state lines and time zones because the market today is supplied by nationwide carriers, right, versus localized wireless services, right? The days of the localized folks are quite frankly over, right? The nationwide carriers have kind of taken over our nation. So, using addresses, area codes, right, any information that you can legally use and sharing that information before making that call or text message is highly, highly recommended. But again, as I mentioned, it is also tricky because the FCC has previously fined major carriers for sharing access to consumers' location data as well, right? So you got to be really careful. It's a fine line of what you can use when, what you should use when making those calls or texts.
And it's interesting. So when I look at the state laws, I think New York is one where their law says it protects anybody located within the state, whereas other state laws will talk about residents of the state.
Mhm.
And it's a very big difference in those two because located in state, that goes to what you were just talking about with that. The only way you would know that is if the carriers gave you that information, which, as you said, they've recently gotten a lot of trouble for that. So that's pretty much out the window. So then you could say, okay, well, then if I just do it based on phone number, I can do that, but like I just mentioned, I live in Phoenix. I'm pointing out the window like everybody can see it, but it's going to be 100 degrees today. It's a cool day. But most days this time of year, you can hear the sun crackling like a bug zapper in the middle of summer in the Midwest. And so people here like to go to the north somewhere during this time of year to get away from the heat. So I'm having this conversation with a member of my team recently. They said, well, why don't we look based on the mailing address? Is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? And that fight is there. I sat back and I thought about it. On the one hand, I say to myself, let's say we're talking about, a bank or something like that, where there is there's a relationship between us to the point where they send me information in the mail that is critical to my account, like my billing statements or something like that. Does that create a better position to where I should say, hey, since I have their address or I have their zip code, I should look at that to determine their time zone versus their phone number? Or do we look at things like case history where I'm not sure if there's been any settlement in favor of somebody because they were called outside of curfew based on a phone number that didn't match where they were located?
I mean, it's gonna depend, Isaac, right? What are your other data points are you using in conjunction with the rest, right? And then more importantly, what state are you calling into, right? So you're gonna have to look at it from a federal level. That's one piece, but then what state are you in, and what does that state regulation require, right? As you correctly mentioned, some of the states are going to require you to use a specific address, right? Some of them specifically mention area code, right? So you're going to have to really do like a data compilation to determine what is the right move, right? Now, is that going to save you in litigation? Probably not, because you're already sued for that violation, right? So the purpose of using the data is really to prevent the lawsuits, the quiet hour provision lawsuits from even falling on your lap.
Now, I do want to get back to something Pooja said earlier about her jetting all over the country. She and I do the same thing. You can connect with both of us in person in California next month at the Law Conference of Champions. I'll have my team drop something in the chat for that in a bit. So it's a great opportunity to market and meet with people locally. Oh, look at that. That's beautiful. So, please make sure you come out and see that, because this is the type of stuff that's going to be talked about for in depth for a very long period of time, all day long. It's going to be great content, great speakers. When we look at those data points and we look at how we're measuring where somebody is at a given point in time, I want to make sure everybody's clear. Area code, and it's funny because I have seen that come up. Area code isn't always good enough. So time zone, just I'm a IT guy at heart, so I'm gonna get a little geeky here. Time zone association was all done based on zip codes, or zip codes were tied to time zones here in the United States. Zip code is the best way to tell what time zone somebody is in. If you go just by the area codes are not necessarily tied to a time zone. They are usually tied to a state, not always. There's a few rare exceptions in the Northwest, but the first 6 digits of the phone number are mapped to a zip code. So zip codes never cross a time zone, never cross a state line. So if you are matching on phone, make sure you're doing the first 6. If you do the first 3, it is not good enough. Great example of that, area code 219, which just happens to be one of the 2 numbers on here, is in both Central and Eastern time, both in the state of Indiana, but 2 different time zones. And that does make a difference because those calling times are based on the time of day that the consumer is supposedly in. But when you're taking this into consideration, when you're looking at how you should be mapping based on zip code, there is also the principle that comes to mind about rebuttable presumption that I've seen in some of the state laws, where there's a rebuttable presumption that if it's like Florida's got this in their statute, if it's a Florida number, it's a Florida number unless you could prove otherwise. So does that add another level of complexity here?
Absolutely. Like if you know the recipient's actual time zone, right? Like imagine lead form, right? When you receive the lead form and the zip code, right, associated with the account or the address that's in that lead form, you must use that, right? Even if the area code ends up being different or misleading. So that's another piece, right? Isaac, if you get the lead form that gives you something that's different from the area code, you should probably be taking that into account as well.
And I don't want to overlook something Pooja said earlier too, and I've seen some businesses successfully deploy this. There's a company that, back in my BPO days, if I said the name, you would all recognize them right away. They had a policy where if the mailing address for the bill didn't match the phone number on the account, then you would call them during this small period in the middle of the day. And Pooja mentioned that briefly earlier. I want to make sure I come back to that because that is a solid strategy a lot of businesses do. If you're incredibly risk adverse, you could do a check to see, do the 2 match? If they don't, then maybe I'm going to call from, noon to 2. You have to take into consideration your entire universe of leads. Is there a possibility that person's in, Hawaii or Guam or something, way out there, one of those outlier cases like that, or Puerto Rico going on the other side where they don't do daylight savings time. So they could be, even further ahead of you than the East Coast is. But that is another strategy that I've seen a lot of businesses use to try to avoid those frivolous lawsuits, and it's sad that we've got to have this conversation because we're talking to people where their primary focus is how can I just be a good actor? That's all I want to do. I just want to follow the rules, make them clear for me. But unfortunately, they're rarely clear.
Right.
Go ahead.
Now, I was going to say, that 11 a.m. to that 9 p.m. Pacific, or sorry, Eastern time only model, it does help a lot of folks stay out of trouble, and especially folks that don't have the resources with, softwares or platforms that already have this information embedded, right? So many dialers, as you know, Isaac, already have call time restriction compliance on the state level and on the federal level, and they're working with other outside counsel to help them, stay apprised on that. So if you don't have those resources, then a good strategy is, restrict it from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern time only.
Absolutely. And start thinking about again, the effectiveness of your outreach. One of the things that we've seen a lot on our remediation product is that we can't get customers remediate. We'll dive into some of their calling practices and we'll see that they're calling people 5, 6 times a day. And that might be legal in the state that they're in. The federal regs are a little ambiguous around it. They just say, no intent to harass and so they talk about not overcalling, but they don't give a number. Some states do have very clear limits, three in a day, no more than one every 8 hours, one per 24, et cetera, depending on your state. But a lot of times I'll see these people calling 6 times in a day, and from what we could tell, is at least legal. It's okay, but is it effective? Or is that leading to more people saying, put me on your do not call list? Or people throwing demand letters out there just hoping they can catch you in something. So one of the trends I'm seeing from a legislative perspective is trying to dial back calling times anyway, where a lot of people are saying, yes, you can call until 9 federally, but we want you to stop calling at 8. Or yes, you can start calling at 8, but we don't want you to call until 9. So start evaluating that in some of your practices too. Look at, especially in these higher risk environments, what is your response rate when you're messaging somebody at 8:30, 9 o'clock, or sorry, 8:59 at night their time? Are you even getting that response? Because limiting that time of day, especially on the later end or well, I guess either end, limiting that may not have a negative impact on you because you may catch consumers in a more friendly environment anyway. So and that's, principles like that are something that Reach, which is an association that Queenie and I are very involved in. That's Eric started, the czar started that over, about 2 years ago now, I think. It's not just about walking the line of compliance, but how do we take a consumer-centric focus to marketing to where we try to be better actors and more self-regulate than require, heavy-handed legislation or rulemaking to come down on us.
Yeah, and I'd be remiss if I didn't add that Reach, along with other groups, has asked the FCC to basically stop these frivolous shakedown lawsuits and actually confirm the law, right? That consented messages may be sent outside of quiet hours because they're not telephone solicitations under the CFR. So now with the McKesson ruling, it'll be interesting to see what happens, or if that it even matters really. But before Friday, we Reach did, along with other agencies, submit to the FCC that these lawsuits need to stop and clarify what the CFR actually states.
And this is where it gets interesting too, because you look at how some people have tried different tactics over the year to get around regulations or to be more effective. And
Mhm.
one thing that came to mind to me in this is the email to text thing, where I know that there was rulemaking discussions around limiting that. But when I look at that, is if I'm using email to generate the text, does that put me in a better position? Because technically on my end, I'm not sending a text message, I'm sending an email. Or is that just kind of an argument that no judge would take seriously?
I think some judges would take it seriously, right? But again, that's going to be a gamble that you're going to be testing in the courts. But email's not covered under their TCPA, right? Just stop right there, right?
Right.
So you're sending an actual email versus, one of those email to text campaigns, that you're going to be clear, but you want to be really careful if it's going to be falling, in the purview of like a text message where it's going directly to a person's phone, but not through their email address.
And
Because,
that's
as you know, right now you can get text messages and it can be sent from, pamin@troutmanamin.com, but it was sent through my email, but it lands into Isaac's text message, funnel as opposed to his email funnel.
Yeah, and so this is again where you need to walk step by step through how you are doing your outreach with your compliance attorneys and make sure what you're doing is wonderful. So one person had even asked, can I really hire Pooja to be my lawyer? She's amazing. I would say absolutely so. And we'll make sure that her information gets put in the chat if it's not already in there. But I believe, yeah, there's a link to the website up there. So you could reach out and they will definitely love to engage. Pooja would love to work with you. And Puja has an entire team behind her as well. So, you're not just getting one expert, you're getting an entire firm full, and they're all outstanding. So, another person has asked, does this apply to all SMS or just calls? I guess that's really the thing. Calls are pretty clear. Everybody accepts the fact that you're not supposed to be making somebody's phone ring at 9:01 p.m. or 9:02 p.m. I think It's still arguable as to how this applies to SMS. So I think there is an argument, especially when there's some sort of EBR or something that seems to take you out of that solicitation definition. I think that there's a clear argument that this applies to, this doesn't apply to them. But I think we need to have some clarity or see where cases go because right now it's slightly ambiguous.
Yeah, and I will add that the reason why this new line of cases are focusing primarily on the text message cases is because they're attacking folks that are doing the text club messages, right? And I think at least it's easier for the plaintiff's attorneys to get a hold of those folks that are receiving the club messages, and often those messages have pretty clear consent, right? They're using, third-party text messaging apps that are, pretty aware of like the TCPA and the regulations, and they're only allowing users of those text platforms to send within an allotted time, right? Those are built in. You can't even revise those even if you wanted to, if you're using the platform. So Gibril in particular is, going after those small to medium-sized businesses that are using what they think are compliant methods of sending text messages to send the messages out.
And again, I think that this is where you also look at what is the purpose of your text, why are you sending it when you're sending it, and what is the mechanism that pushes it out there? So when you're giving it to your text provider, does your text provider have the proper controls in place to make sure that they're following all those time of day rules? There's a lot of systems that are out there where you'll queue up, 10,000 leads, 100,000 leads to get the coupon of the week or whatever. People, I've got this with my local car wash. I'm on the national do not call list, but I have opted in to get coupons to my local car wash because, hey, who doesn't love saving $10? But as long as I'm just getting a text message, once a week with a coupon, I'm happy. But I look at that and I say, that is something that somebody has opted into, somebody's requested. But if I send my database of 10,000 people to my provider, how fast are they going to get through that list? Are they going to load that list and just go through it until they stop, period? Or are they going to send those text messages until they hit a time of day restriction? And then they're going to send the rest the next day. Make sure that you're asking those questions because ultimately you're the one that's going to be sued, not the text provider. And indemnity clauses are only as good as the language behind them. And that still is the same thing to any damage it could do to your brand. But there are limits in phone lines as to how fast text messages can be sent out. Some of that is supposed to be improved with 10DLC. Now there's all kinds of new challenges with 10DLC getting registered in the first place, but there are output limits. So just make sure that your provider has the bandwidth to do it during legal hours and has the controls to stop it or pause it once legal hours end. I'm going to try to hit because I know we've got about 15-ish minutes left, so I'm going to hit a few of these Q&As here. Just one I saw that was really quick and easy. Is there a separate do not call list, or is it the same as DNC? Answer quite simply is it is the same. I'm not aware of any separate list for not texting, and I'm not aware of any situations where somebody who is on a do not call list is still allowed to be texted. Are you aware of anything on that line, Pusha?
Not just keeping in mind that there's, the national DNC, but then state levels have their own DNC as well. But I'm not aware of anything specific to just text or call as being separated.
And if any of you subscribe to our compliance guide at dnc.com, there is a section there called the consent chart. And if you come to Law Conference of Champions, I'd be happy to show it to you personally from my phone. Hint, hint, get out there to California. But there is a section where we talk specifically about text messaging, and that's where it gets a little strange because I have seen some really weird rules. Like California and Rhode Island essentially have a requirement where you have to have an EBR to be allowed to text someone, which is a really weird way of looking at it and something you don't see on the phone. So it's not even saying that somebody can consent to get those messages unless you argue that that consent is, the definition or meets the definition of EBR. But there are some weird rules around that. But just as far as who you can solicit and over the phone versus text, no separate list that we're aware of at this time.
Yeah, the one thing I want to add, Isaac, for you folks who, are really, really taking this stuff seriously and want to get buttoned down, your DNC policies, right, should reflect these regulations, right? Your DNC policy should state that you will not make telephone solicitations between X and X time throughout the day. For larger clients, right, larger enterprise clients, if you have the resources, I would highly recommend that you have state level DNC policies as well that track your procedures on your call time restrictions, because your procedures need to match your policies and vice versa.
And it's funny that you bring that up because that is something that shockingly I have had maybe five in the last month where I've had a customer come to us and we've asked them for a copy of their internal do not call policies because we're vetting them for our remediation practice. And they say, oh, we don't have those and we're not required to have those or we don't need to have those. And they're telemarketers. I don't understand that argument. I mean, have you seen an uptick in that or do people you talk to generally aware they need that?
No, I have not seen that. I will see folks who just, aren't aware of the rules, but not that they're not required to have it, right? Usually, if you're making any outbound call or text message, if you're, a telemarketer, you need to have a DNC policy. And how robust or how simplified your DNC policy is going to depend on your operations.
Yeah, so if you don't have an internal do not call policy or just a do not call policy in general, you need to have one right away. That's the easiest compliance gap, in my opinion, to close. And having the policies is great. That's step one. Step two is audit, verify that they're actually being followed. Do some spot checks, maybe, try to get yourself on your list and put yourself in your do not call list so that you can see if it's actually honored. But that is, really important. There's so many lawsuits I have seen, a lot of them covered on TCPA World recently about people just not honoring internal do not call lists. So somebody's getting these calls, they don't want them in the first place. They say, put me on your do not call list. The calls keep coming, and then there's a lawsuit, or the texts keep coming in some cases.
Yeah, and
Um,
that when you're sued, right, that's the first thing the plaintiff's attorneys are going to ask for, and they're going to, ask you questions to make sure that your procedures are matching what is said in your policy. So just having a policy, that seems aspirational, it seems great, but it's not going to be enough. Those audits, as Isaac mentioned, are extremely crucial as well.
Yeah, and it's funny because then you start talking about information that could be left out versus information that could be put in. There's an interesting question that was put in here where they're saying, in your experience, how do courts tend to view after hours texts when prior express consent was obtained, but without any time specific limitations? Does that lack of detail increase your risk or does it help your risk? And it's interesting because they're not specifically saying we're going to call you within legal hours. They're not necessarily saying we're going to call you outside of legal hours. They're just getting general consent. So does that help you or does that make it worse? Or is it of no effect as of yet?
I think so far it's of no effect. Is it of effect if you want to get rid of a gibril demand or a lawsuit? Probably, right? Effective. But as it pertains to like the court rulings and how they're viewing that, we don't know yet.
But it is interesting and something to think about. The more that you put out there, you'll say that, there's an expression, something along the lines of you could tell somebody's lying because they won't shut up. And if that's
Hmm.
the case, I'm a constant liar because I never shut up, as everybody can tell here. But the uh, the approach of this is, or I've seen this sometimes where you put too much detail, you say we're going to do exactly this, and you spell out prescriptively what you're going to do. If you step outside of those lines, technically you're not doing what you agreed to. So I think that there is something to be said for that argument of being careful exactly how much you commit to.
Right. You want to use outside counsel for those policies, or internal counsel, to draft those policies and folks that really understand your operation so they can tell you whether you need more generalized statements or more specific statements, depending on how, how compliant you really are with your procedures or how strict you are with your procedures. I mean, I can foresee a company who's extremely strict, has all the belts in, suspenders, and they want to show off, if you will, their compliance procedures, right? And then they want to state that in the policy. So in the event that they're sued, right, they can back it up and they know they can back it up. So it just depends on how confident you are with your belts and suspenders.
Now, another interesting, and I'm going to get to another question here that I find interesting, and I hadn't really considered this one yet. There's two types of ways, obviously, you're going to come across your records. There's three ways you're going to be buying leads from a third party. So you're going to be working with a lead generator who's trying to find qualified, high intent buyers, sending them over to you. You're going to have your own first party lead gen where people are going to come to your website. They're going to fill out a form saying, hey, I want to talk to you. you're also going to have your existing customer base. And so like back in my BPO days, that's primarily who I work with, like these giant banks that are, just bedrocks, and they're just reaching out to their customers, trying to upsell, trying to maintain the account, whatever they're trying to do. But let's say you're in an environment where you are doing first party lead generation. If you're asking them what are the best times of day to call you, and they specify that and you capture that and you've got like, Jernaya and all of that, is that a way to approach it? Or is that still one of those sounds interesting, but we have to see how things go in court?
Well, it depends, right? So if I'm putting myself into the shoes of the new cases, right, and as a plaintiff's attorney, I'm going to argue that's not sufficient because that was a verbal consent, right, as opposed to a written consent, right? So it depends. For the outreach you're doing, do you need that prior express consent or do you need that full prior express written consent, right? And then it's going to depend on that and what type of solicitations you're sending and what level of consent you need to determine whether that's going to be sufficient. It's the same thing, the question we get asked all the time, Isaac, right? Is a verbal consent to call me back later going to be sufficient? Well, it depends if what type of technology you're using, right, to call those folks back. So, there's a lot of pieces that need to be analyzed in order to answer that question.
And I think the same thing goes to this other question here about, if someone's signing up for a webinar or they're responding to an ad and it's outside of legal calling hours, should we leave out the SMS and stay with the email? I think that's another one of those where you got to look at it on a case by case basis. Um,
Your
text
text, you have to include it, right? If you're making pre-recorded calls, you have to include that in the disclosure, right? But if you know you're
absolutely.
not making the text or the pre-record calls, then okay, you can leave it out.
Now, what about, I've seen a lot lately about people trying to, force like arbitration or something like that in their terms and conditions. And one of the people in here have asked the question if there's terms and conditions to, prevent a class action from happening or something like that. Would that push out Hindi firm or others or try somewhat discourage them? I don't even know if Hindi's really going after class actions as much as, it seems like it's almost a split between the class actions and just the onesie twosie suits,
Well,
right?
no, he's going after the class actions, and
Okay.
yeah. From my experience, right, from the cases that are coming into Troutman Amin, we're seeing class actions, Isaac, which is insanity, right? Because he's bringing different class definitions for the quiet hours, for the internal DNC, and the argument goes right at the pleading stage on the defense side that you want to argue that these telephone solicitations had consent, and he's not even mentioning consent in his allegations. They all tracked very, very similar allegations, and they're almost like copycat class action suits that he's filing. But oh no, he's going after the class actions, which makes, these cases very, very alarming. But sorry, I forgot was there a question pending, Isaac?
So just the question was, if you've got some sort of terms that limit class action, does that give you more protection?
Oh yeah, so if you have a valid arbitration clause, right, and you can show that the consumer affirmatively accepted that arbitration and it was clear, you want to look at state law and how they view arbitration clauses. And if you have a strong arbitration clause and a strong consent record showing that that consumer accepted the arbitration clause, you need to move to compel arbitration immediately, right? That is something that you should look at as soon as you receive the complaint, is if arbitration is available to push him, out of federal court.
And just for the questions about AI, and it's funny, Pooja and I were at CCW a week before last, and everybody was talking about AI. Nobody understood the implications from a risk perspective, from a legal perspective. It was scary how uninformed everybody was. So just to be clear, it doesn't matter if you are sending these out with a human, if you have this as a scheduled job, if you have AI sending this out, the rules about when you're calling are the rules about when you're calling. Now, if you're using AI, there may be additional things you have to be worried about on top of time of day, such as like provisions around pre-recorded voice and things like that. But when you're talking about follow-ups, appointment setting, again, there is likely risk there, but this is where you'll want to review on a case-by-case basis with qualified counsel how this applies to exactly what you're sending out there. But from just I want to be as far away from risk as possible, however you're communicating with them, make sure it's during legal hours and you'll be safer.
Right.
Hard to say safe, but safer.
Safer. That's
Safer.
never bulletproof around here. It's always how can you get to the safest position possible.
Exactly. Now, if the text has an opt-out option, and this is an interesting question because I'm going to take it to the next level too. So the question as typed is, if the text has an opt-out option, but the client still chooses to participate, are you still liable, or does the opt-out verbiage provide protection? Before you answer that question, I would just throw another monkey wrench in there and say, what if you're using a text campaign and I've texted them at 6 p.m. and they get back to me at 10 p.m.? Can I reply to them like I'm continuing the conversation that they initiated or not? I mean, there's even that 15-minute window when somebody opts out where you can send them a clarification, on that. Would I even be able to send that if they set me a stop at 10 o'clock at night? What are those implications?
You receive an opt-out, regardless of what your consent record states, you have to process that as a revocation within 10 days now, right? The opt-out disclosures that I often see in the TCPA disclosures is usually to provide folks with guidance that even if you're on the national DNC list, right, I can still override that DNC and send you a text message. As soon as you get that opt-out, no more, unless you're sending that one-time clarification message that can't have any marketing component to it, but you have to until they re-opt in or provide their prior express written consent again thereafter. So if they opt out at 6, you cannot text them later until somewhere between 6 and the time you want to text them that they have re-opted in.
And there's a lot more questions in here I'd love to get to. I just did a quick time check, and we are actually over by a minute, and I want to be sensitive to Pooja's time. Pooja will be joining me again on Wednesday. We'll be talking again about something a much different. The big news around Hobbs that came out on Friday. We'll be breaking that down as best as we can in an hour. There's going to be a lot more discussion that Eric Troutman, Pooja's partner, is going to be discussing, and I'm sure many on her team are going to bring up in California. This will be a topic there. So I guarantee this will be a great point of discussion there. So please join us at the webinar Wednesday. Join us at the Law Conference of Champions in Irvine in July. Yeah.
And if you want a text coupon for Law Conference of Champions, email me. I'll get you one. Or maybe I'll personally text you myself.
And she'll do it during legal calling hours to make sure that she's not getting a direct letter. So with that, thank you. I will try to follow up with the rest of the questions offline. Feel free to reach out to us at dnc.com, at troutmanamin.com. We look forward to more engagement with you. And Pooja, as always, thank you. And I look forward to talking again in 48 hours.
Thanks, Isaac. Talk soon.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.